Well, Paul, my friend, I thank you. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I did give the Jefferson Lecture, but unless I'm hemmed in pretty tight anymore, I don't write lectures. What about that? This sound system is another triumph of modern civilization. What I'm going to do is read an outline that could become the outline of a lecture if I wanted to write it, in the hope that I'll say enough in a short time to provoke questions and comments. And then I'll bask in the security of knowing that I'm talking about things you want me to talk about rather than presuming to know ahead of time what you ought to hear me say. All right, let's see how we get along. To be talking in a school is always for me to confront the issue, now the problem, of vocation. A vocation is a calling. A job is a more or less accidental employment. Is a student in a school being trained for a job or delivered into a vocation? To what extent is specialization compatible with vocation? I don't know. The question is useful, and I leave it open. Specialization and professionalization in the industrial economy are justified by efficiency, productivity, and profitability, which function as synonyms, and all three are reductive. Specialization serves reduction and abstract purposes, but it is experienced by the specialists themselves and their clients as fragmentation. Workers on assembly lines do not need to know and may not know the product they're making or its purpose. Patients undergoing surgery are moved through an industrial system from one specialist to another, by none of whom they are known. Beneficiaries of the specialist system also suffer from it. Patients may be healed, but they know they're treated as numbers or objects. They are helped and they are degraded. They know this. Doctors, if they're people of sense, suffer on their own edge of the chasm between the professional and the personal. People who work in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries are hurt, and some of them know that they are, by their reduction of people to statistics. People in real estate development are hurt by building malls or suburbs in places they may never have seen, and some feel the wound. I'm talking about a letter I received recently. The land suffers by being treated as an abstract grid of interchangeable squares. Within specialties or professions or categories of need, it is possible for people to feel personally isolated or fragmented. But the estrangement of specialties, professions, disciplines, kinds of work from one another brings us into intellectual absurdity, nonsense, and real damage on a large scale. We have not really begun yet even to recognize the damages inherent and inevitable in the disconnections of medicine from health, health from food, food from agriculture, and agriculture from ecology. And so we tolerate, profit from, and suffer from the illusion that people can be made healthy in a diseased community, or a toxic ecosystem, or a diseased and toxic world. Another radical disconnection is that between home and school, education and life. We now are hearing from experts about the necessity of early childhood education, the evident assumption being that education takes place only in school. But education is taking place everywhere, all the time. If a child has a decent early childhood home life, then early childhood education is assuredly happening, no thanks to schools or so-called educators. And we mustn't forget that you can be educated for evil. You can be given a bad education for bad reasons. If you educate somebody who's naturally inclined to be a crook, you don't reform him. You make him more dangerous as a crook. All the oddities I've mentioned, and there are many others, are caused by the fragmentation of the old structures of human commonwealth, families, local communities or neighborhoods, local economies, local churches and schools, and by the still increasing disassociation of the professions from local communities. These, in turn, are direct results of the limitless industrial quest for efficiency, productivity, and profitability. Underlying all these fragmentations is the fundamental incompatibility between industrial technologies and processes and the forms and orders of nature and of human nature. The forms of organic or creaturely life are not, except by the most violent reduction, machines or like machines. When we come to human nature, the discord and the distortion are even worse. Engineered compassion, healing, and education. The reduction of vocation to a job. The reduction of truth to information. And maybe I'll say as a kind of coda that I have a family doctor whom I've known for many years, has been my doctor for many years. And as a layman, I don't have any standard by which to judge him. I don't know whether he's, really, I don't know whether he's a good doctor or not. I don't know whether he's the best possible doctor or not. But if I had an offer to choose my doctor as he is, or the guaranteed best possible doctor, I'd choose my doctor. And it's because we've invested in each other. We're friends. We know each other. It's worth an inestimable amount to me to be known by somebody to whom I am, after all, intimately connected. And if he made a mistake and I died from it, so what? I'm an old man and I can say that free of charge. But death, contrary to what the medical establishment and the healing industry seems to think, is not a disease. It's not something we're ever going to be cured of. People have been dying for a long, long time, and every one of them has managed to do it. So, I'm ready now to hear from you, and if you don't have anything to say, then I'm off easy.
So this is being recorded. We're going to ask those of you with questions to use the microphone so that this will show up.
Yeah, we don't want to lose anything. Posterity will want to hear from you.
We have one on the other side, so we'll take turns.
What's the matter now?
You're in shadow.
Oh, for God's sake.
I'll start. Your concern that specialization is driven by, let's say, efficiency, productivity, and profitability, I think raises a bit of a problem. I'm a philosopher, by the way, and hence have never been accused of any of those three things. But what each of those concerns gives is a reason for each individual to focus on specialization. Your example of health, food, agriculture, and ecology all being understood together, it just seems so obvious when you observe it from the outside.
I didn't hear that part.
It just seems obvious when you observe it from the outside why you need to look at all of those things together. But the individual farmer is going to be concerned with his own productivity. So we have a sort of a prisoner's dilemma problem here, where each individual is driven by the need for productivity and profitability, so that we as a whole end up with a really bad circumstance. How might we start to implement the kind of defragmentation that you're suggesting when we're facing this kind of real problem in beginning?
Okay. All right. Your analysis of the problem is exactly right, and I really appreciate the way you phrased your question. How can we start? It is a fact that farmers tend to be interested only in production. And so that's exactly true of pharmaceutical companies. So the question really is, how do you free people in their vocations from the economic constraint that stop this exclusive focus on production or efficiency or profitability? Well, let's start with the farmer, since I know more about farming than I do about pharmacy. The farmer is going to be more and more focused on productivity as he or she becomes more and more specialized. So these farmers in the Midwest are suffering enormously from the drought. But they're suffering from the drought because they're exclusively dependent on one or two crops, corn and or soybeans. Now, if you'd go back a couple of generations to those farms, say in Iowa, you would have smaller farms, less at risk, less borrowed on any year's work, and a great deal more diversity. So So that a farm, for instance, that grew wheat in addition to corn and beans, which they would have done as a cover crop on last year's corn or bean fields if they were farming on the right scale. The drought didn't really hit until the wheat crop was harvested. So they would have had that. If they still had fences around those corn and bean fields, they could have turned the livestock in. Or if they had livestock, they could have shredded or baled those cornfields after they had failed, before they had been bleached out by the sun. So, how do you begin? You have to change the standard by which everybody is measured and all work is judged. And I've thought about this for years, and I can't come up with a universal standard that will serve everybody except the idea of ecological health. In other words, if you take the farmer's mind off his farm and its health, its adjustment, adaptation to the local ecosystem, and put it on production, you've just set a train of events in place that will finally destroy the farm. And that indeed is happening. So, health. Health, you know, is a part of a family of words that include heal, whole, halo, holy, not this word holism, but holy. And so, if you had a health system that was really interested in health and could start with the context in which individuals are living, then the whole system, it seems to me, would change. You've got a pharmaceutical industry now that spends $2 billion to develop a drug. And they've got to have a bestseller ever so often, I forget how often, every year, every 2 years, or they go under. Well, that happens to the publishing industry. That's already happened. It's already virtually killed the virtue, the usefulness in the publishing industry. They've got to have bestsellers. They're spending too much money. It might be conceivable, under a different system with different standards, that somebody who developed a really good drug could keep selling it for several years. So if you don't have health as the standard, then you feed your animals in confinement on a steady diet of antibiotics that is it's an evolutionary situation in which to grow antibiotic-resistant germs. So that's going to goose your pharmaceutical industry along to keep developing more and more drugs. So, you see, I think it would right itself if you had the standards right. And to do that, you'd have to get the scale right, of course.
Is it on? I'm a family physician, and I went into family medicine because because it
So start again. I was looking at the wrong fellow.
This is very loud. So I went into family medicine because it absolutely irked me and bothered me that specialists would divide the body up into systems that almost didn't recognize the other systems that exist in the body. And also because people need doctors to help them with medical problems and health, and that implies generalism. It also implies that common things are common. It's wonderful to look for the rare, odd things, but that doesn't come up very often. So we have arrived at a point in this country, I don't know if this statistic still holds, but I read years ago in the Courier Journal that only 2% of American medical school graduates go into primary care. That means 98% of graduates do not go into primary care. And we're also at a point where we might have this healthcare change where more people will be getting medical insurance. So the country has to gear up for generalists. I have nothing against nurse practitioners or PAs, but I'm afraid that they're going to be used to fill in the gaps. And their training is not as good, generally speaking, and I've worked with many of them. None of them are bad. I'm not saying they're bad people, but how, so enough of that. My question to you is, from your perspective, what can we do to have more general medical doctors in this country?
We're in a university here.
Can I take a crack at that?
Let me answer that lady's question, and then we'll get on. What we need, obviously, is a kind of general criticism. People who are capable of asking questions like yours and having them treated not in idle conversation or not even in situations like this, but in serious, prolonged consideration by people in different disciplines. If it's ever going to start, a university would be a good place to start it. But people in universities don't talk to each other across these compartmental lines. They need to do it. Wes Jackson and I have talked for years about a university curriculum that would simply begin with the question, where are we? And then it would go on to questions like this. What's happened here? What should have happened here? What should we be doing now? And none of those questions like that, can't be answered in a department. You'd have to call in people who knew other things for help. It's much more clumsy. It implies a great clumsiness, really, and a lot of frustration to assume that it can start with each of us in our hometowns, people agreeing to require certain things of their servants. But that too is possible, but again, you have to get the standards right.
You tell me that this is ready to.
Thank you, Mr. Berry, and I bet you everybody in the room agrees with you. I think America is on an unsustainable medical course without more primary care and preventative medicine. Because exactly the points you say that your good old doctor back home knows you and takes care of you. And what the fragmentation and subspecialization, I think, is right now killing the whole healthcare system by fragmentation. And to answer you, what could you do about it? I think there's two answers. One is prestige and the other is money. And if you don't have more money and more prestige in the primary care, the kids graduate from medical school with big bills. well, they're going to go into the high-pay specialties. It doesn't take a mystery to figure that one out, I think.
Well, that's right. Sustainability is another suggestive issue. And the way to start that conversation, wherever it needs to take place, would be to ask how dependent on everything you're doing now is on the fossil fuels. West Jackson is starting to talk now about the hump. When we get over the hump, that is this little tiny era of cheap fossil fuels, when we've got over that, what must we be thinking about then? What is the kind of medicine, the kind of understanding of health, the kind of understanding of the human body and mind and their union and their further union with their communities? What kind of resilience can we give that kind of knowledge so that it can be effective once we're over the hump?
Hi, Mr. Berry. I'm a palliative care doctor here at the university, and I really appreciate all of your comments. I think that a challenge that we face in the medical community is one that highlighted in lots of different fields, and that is that people are not talking with one another. And I think that a lot of physicians feel powerless, and I'll give you an example that you may have read in the Career Journal that there's a pill mill bill that's gone through, and that a lot of us who treat cancer pain, for example, or chronic pain, and really are dealing with patients who are suffering and we're trying to impact their health and their quality of life, that a lot of us are feeling like our hands are being tied, or some very unreasonable expectations are being placed on us. And I think a lot of that, when you hear the way that the whole debate is framed, physicians in the papers are portrayed as being whiny and misinterpreting the law, and I think a lot of it we bring upon ourselves, but a lot of it is just this sort of tendency to find someone to blame and to prematurely judge others instead of sitting down together and having a dialogue when ideas are being tossed around and plans are being implemented. And so I know some physicians say, well, what do we do? We can't go on strike and say this isn't fair, so we're not going to see patients. But some doctors are doing that. We're not going to see these patients.
Doctors are doing what now?
In the paper, there were some physicians who said, this is too complicated. I'm just not going to treat pain anymore. I'm not going to prescribe these medications. And when you talk about a job versus a vocation, I think there are serious implications for that. So I think that there's an issue of powerlessness in terms of physicians and in terms of impacting change and the process by which they can do that, and that there aren't the right people sitting at the table. And I think that those are reasons, too, that patient care is suffering. I wondered if you could just address that, all of those issues and what you're thinking.
Well, some of that seemed to be addressed more directly to me than other parts, or that interested me more. But I am interested in this pill problem. It's clearly a shortcut, and one can understand readily the temptation. Somebody comes to you, they're hurting, they're distressed, or whatever, and you give them a pill, and they go home happy, and you don't have to think about it anymore. And enough of that goes on, and it invites very complicated legislation. And to me, the fault there is that the real complexity, the real complication, isn't addressed. One of the headquarters for this pill problem is Eastern Kentucky. And suppose, instead of, this is an incredible supposition, but suppose the state legislature were really interested in that problem they would have to ask sooner or later, what is the ratio between the economy, the economic situation of Eastern Kentucky and the psychology and physiology of the people? And they would set about, it seems to me, trying to solve that problem where it originates, rather than to deal with the really expensive, in many ways, shortcuts that are simply afforded to them by pill mills. You see this in talking to legislators. Anybody who brings a problem to somebody raises the temptation to get rid of them as quickly as possible and make them happy. If you go to complain to your legislator, you're apt to receive that kind of treatment up in Frankfurt. The legislator wants to say something that'll please you, that shows that he or she is really attentive to your problems, and you go away feeling happy and even flattered, and no transaction has happened. Well, maybe that's enough. That's a tremendous prologue you gave. Yeah. I'm sure we agree on everything.
Hi, my name is Kyle. There are a couple of places in your writings where Louisville doctors make cameos, and one of my favorites is in a short story called Fidelity, where there's a doctor who's described as talking from within a glass box. So as a student who attended school here, and as a doctor who practices here, we see ourselves in that, I think. We don't want to talk from within a glass box, but we do. So how do people trying to do good in a complex system start to actually have the types of relationships that you write about without changing the whole system?
Yeah.
I'm just a student trying to do a good job.
Well, the problem for doctors of medicine really gets to be suffering at a certain point. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, there's an article in last week's New Yorker called Big Med, in which somebody is proposing that we can be better served by chains of hospitals than by, and the patient is a perfect fragment, as he or she is discussed in this article. A lone individual. And the author describes treatment, surgery that his mother had in one of these wonderful hospitals, and she was served by 63 different people. But if you're a neurosurgeon and you're one of those 63, you're apt to be the guy in the hospital room who finally has to confront the family and say, look, it's no use anymore. There's no way to make that efficient. And it's a position of great suffering, I know, because I have friends who know from their experience. Then there's a perfectly human impulse, unless you're a kind of monster, to reach out of the glass box and take a hand, do something, say a prayer, hug somebody, I don't know what you do. The same kind of glass box happens between teachers and students. And the thing you have to recognize is well, you're speaking from the faculty point of view, and you know that the temptation as a faculty person is to be shed of the student if you can, get back to work. I heard that a lot in my university days. Professors just telling students, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I've got my research to do, can't talk to you now. Well, that's not a teacher, even. Not a teacher, if you're talking to your students that way. But you have to understand that this is a glass box in schools that the students are responsible for, too. I mean, they help to contrive that glass box by being passive consumers, sitting there and looking smart and taking notes or doing whatever they do now, texting somebody. But I remember back when the time of the student rebellion, you know, in the 60s and 70s, and the students would come in and want to know what they ought to do. And so, well, I'd say you might try being a student. And the way you do that is insist on being taught. Ask questions. If you don't get an answer, ask your teacher for time. If you don't get time, go to the dean. Bring your parents to the dean's office. Now, you could wreck this place in 2 weeks.
Let's see, I'm pro-primary care as a solution, but a different form of primary care that exists currently. I would also like to say I'm not anti-subspecialist medicine, because I think without the achievements in subspecialty medicine, which has resulted in breakthroughs in managing diseases that were deemed unmanageable in the past. But I think there's a new model on the horizon, and it's called a patient-centered medical home. So it's a different form of primary care. It's a location where the patient should feel at home, where they're understood, where all the data pertaining to their healthcare is housed. And it's a strong interdisciplinary model. So typically, primary care physician, family physician, general internist would be the core, but surrounded by nurse practitioners, PAs, and nutritionists, perhaps an exercise physiologist, psychologist, and then access to all the subspecialty areas. I mean, this is a model that's being promoted, not typically by hospitals, but by industry, by people who pay the unaffordable premiums. And to me, at least, that's a ray of hope. To address the issue of the huge debt that medical students accumulate, yeah, there is a status issue, but you know, if you have a reasonable ego, you can overcome that. I think for students then who would select that as a career, a debt forgiveness program spread over 5 years, 10 years could help remedy the problem. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. We'd have to talk a long time before I could venture a judgment of what you've said. But I will say that I'm not an opponent of specialization per se, or in any absolute way. If you want a job well done, it needs to be done by somebody who's done it before, obviously. And I suppose if we were going to try to say where the limit on specialization ought to be, we would say that it has to end at the point where the specialist ought to accept responsibility, not just to the patient, but to the whole community. And of course, I'm old enough to remember doctors who made house calls, who were part of the community, lawyers too. And so their expertise, their specialty, their special knowledge was, so to speak, in residence in the community. The community had access to the knowledge, and the knower knew the community as well as his expertise. One of my favorite stories about my town of Port Royal is that one of the old doctors was walking along the street one day, and one of his compatriots met him and said, "Doc, I'm sort of constipated. What do I ought to do about it?" And the doctor said, and kept walking, "Keep eating, buddy." Well, he knew his man, you see. That's really important. It didn't cost anybody anything, made a good story. And the two people were functioning as members, one of another, in a way that I like. There's also a story in Port Royal about the fellow who got the itch, and he was going to the doctor to get something done about it. And on the way to the doctor, he realized that he was enjoying scratching so much that he didn't want to be healed, so he just went back home.
Thank you for being with us today. Mr. Berry, I have a kind of general question. What would you say would be the most important things that we can do as parents, as grandparents, as teachers, so that we might see a new generation that values resilience, holistic thinking, and the community more than, say, personal profitability?
Okay. Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think that a fundamental truth about childhood and humans is that children need to be raised by a lot of people. They need to be raised by a so-called extended family. They need grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, neighbors who will feel free to give them a swat and send them home if they are getting into danger or trouble. And I think we're suffering a lot for want of that kind of situation. That thought doesn't mean that I have an idea about how to remedy that. But I did have a friend tell me not very long ago his granddaughter was living with him and his wife. She wasn't getting along too well with her mom. Well, I said, she won't grow up. Maybe if she keeps on getting along well with her mom. She needs to fall out with her mom. That way she'll grow up. But if she falls out with her mom, she needs her grandparents, who'll be a little more forgiving, maybe, a little easier to get along with. You got to have somebody to flee to if you're going to rebel. You can't. Otherwise, you go to the street to rebel. And that's wrong. But that seems to me to be true. And that it's going to be hard to achieve again is no reason to deny the truth of it.
Time is here.
Okay. There you go.
We hate to call it time, but it is time. We have to make a transition, and there's still things to do here. But first of all, let's give our expression of appreciation to Wendell Berry.